The cozy cafe in the heart of the city was quiet, as autumn reluctantly gave way to the first winter chill. Outside, the sounds of traffic echoed, but inside, it was peaceful, the air filled with the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee. The atmosphere was calm, almost surreal, as patrons sat at their tables, enjoying their drinks and soft conversations. Time seemed to slow here, and no one was in a hurry to leave. At a small table by the window sat a solitary man, his clothes simple, a dark jacket and worn jeans. His face was partially obscured by shadow, but his eyes remained fixed on the steam rising from his coffee, as if lost in thought. He didn't seem to notice the noise around him or the bustle of the cafe. Everything about him exuded calm, a stillness that contrasted sharply with the world outside. Suddenly, the door of the cafe swung open, and a group of young men burst in, their loud voices breaking the silence. They were boisterous and brash, making no attempt to blend in. Their laughter echoed off the walls as they passed the counter, scanning the room for someone, or something, to entertain them. Their eyes locked on the solitary man at the window. The redhead in the group grinned, nudging his friends as he pointed toward the man. "Hey, look at this guy. What's he doing sitting alone?" They approached the table with a swagger, each of them eager to join in on the fun. "What's up, man?" the redhead called, his voice mockingly loud. "You lost or something?" The others snickered, taking their seats around the table. Their jokes came faster, sharper, each one more cruel than the last. They tried to provoke the man, aiming to humiliate him. "What, you can't talk? You're just sitting there all by yourself like some loser?" The man didn't respond. His gaze remained steady, his focus on the coffee in his hands. He didn't react to their taunts, didn't give them the satisfaction of a flinch. His silence only seemed to fuel their aggression. "You think you're too good for us or something?" the redhead sneered, leaning closer. "Just sitting there like nobody matters?" The man remained impassive, his face unreadable. The group grew louder, more insistent. "What, you think you're too important to talk to us?" one of them jeered. A third member of the group, a tall, lean guy, stood up and walked around to the man's side, his voice dripping with mockery. "Don't be shy now. We're just trying to be friendly," he said, grabbing the man's shoulder roughly. The cafe fell into a tense silence as the group waited for a response. They were hoping for something, anything, to break the man's calm demeanor. But when he did react, it wasn't in the way they expected. Without warning, the man's hand shot out, seizing the wrist of the one who had touched him. In one swift, fluid motion, he twisted the wrist, sending the guy stumbling backward, crashing to the floor. The noise was like a clap of thunder, cutting through the air. The group froze, stunned by the sudden turn of events. Before any of them could react, the man stood up, his movements fast and precise. He didn't shout or make a sound, just a series of swift motions that left the others no time to recover. One by one, the members of the group found themselves disarmed and incapacitated, their confidence drained as the man moved with a practiced grace. Within moments, the entire group lay sprawled on the floor, bewildered and groaning, their egos shattered. The cafe was silent, the tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. All eyes were on the man, who stood over them, his posture calm, almost serene. He didn't speak, didn't taunt them. He simply returned to his seat as if nothing had happened, picking up his coffee cup once more and taking another sip. His gaze never left the window. The group of thugs, now humiliated and beaten, struggled to get to their feet, their faces flushed with anger and embarrassment. The other patrons, too stunned to move, watched in silence. The once lively cafe had become a graveyard of shattered bravado. The man, however, seemed untouched by it all. He finished his coffee without another word, stood up slowly, and walked to the counter to pay for his drink. As the door closed behind him, the group of thugs remained motionless, still processing what had just happened. The tension in the room lingered, a heavy silence hanging in the air. The once confident bullies were left humiliated, their heads low in shame. The man had shown them something they hadn't expected, a quiet, unassuming strength that was far more terrifying than any outburst of violence. And as the last of the thugs limped out of the cafe, the question lingered in the minds of the witnesses. Who was that man? The days following the incident at the cafe felt uneasy, as if the air itself had thickened with unspoken tension. The cafe quickly returned to its normal routine, chattering patrons, the clink of coffee cups, and the quiet hum of the espresso machine. Yet, a subtle discomfort lingered among those who had witnessed the shocking turn of events. For Jake, the redhead who had been part of the group humiliated that day, the incident wouldn't let him go. It was a constant buzz in his mind, gnawing at him, replaying over and over. His pride, already bruised, now felt broken. The way the man had handled them, so effortlessly, so calmly, left him more disturbed than he cared to admit. The man had shown no fear, no anger, just cold, precise control. Jake couldn't understand it. He was used to bullying weaker targets, used to being the one in control. But the man had shattered that illusion with one quick movement. And for the first time in a long while, Jake felt real fear. Days passed, but Jake couldn't shake the memory of the man's eyes, those cold, calculating eyes that seemed to see right through him. They were haunting him, like a shadow that refused to fade. He couldn't let it go. One evening, Jake gathered the remnants of his crew, the ones who had been with him at the cafe, at a dimly lit bar on the edge of town. It was far enough away that no one would recognize them, but close enough that Jake could feel the weight of their failure hanging over them. "You still thinking about him?" Mark, a large guy with a permanent scowl, asked, nursing his drink. "We already got what we deserved. It's over." But Jake shook his head, his expression hardening. "It's not over. We need to find out who he is. No one moves like that without reason." He knew what he was doing. The others exchanged uneasy glances. Ben, the youngest and most nervous of the group, shifted in his seat. "Why don't we just leave it, man? He's out of our league. Let's forget about him." But Jake's voice was relentless. "We can't. That guy, he's hiding something. I'm going to find out who he is, where he comes from. This doesn't just happen." The others fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. They could feel the unease, the fear that Jake had managed to awaken in them. But none of them were ready to admit it. They knew they'd made a mistake, but the idea of confronting the man again stirred something deeper, something that whispered of consequences they weren't ready to face. Jake began his hunt, searching for any trace of the mysterious man who had wiped the floor with them. Every day, he returned to the cafe, hoping for a glimpse of the same quiet figure, but the man never reappeared. It was as if he had vanished without a trace. Days turned into weeks, and Jake's obsession grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that the man had deliberately disappeared, that he was being watched. The unease gnawed at him. He had to know who he was up against. One cold evening, Jake entered the cafe again, his eyes scanning the room. He had come here for one reason, to find the man. This time, there was no sign of him. But as Jake sipped his drink, a shadow moved in the corner of his vision. His heart skipped a beat. There, standing at the entrance, was the man. Jake's breath caught in his throat. For a split second, their eyes met, and a cold shiver ran down Jake's spine. The man's gaze was like ice, sharp and calculating. But then, just as quickly, he turned away, strolling toward the counter as if Jake wasn't even there. Jake froze, his mind racing. What was he supposed to do now? Was this a trap? Had the man been watching him all this time, waiting for him to come back? Before Jake could make a decision, the door opened again. A man in a sharp suit entered, his presence commanding attention. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with purpose. Jake's instincts screamed at him. There was something off about this guy, something that didn't belong here. The suited man walked straight to the barista, speaking in hushed tones. His eyes swept the cafe, lingering just a moment too long on Jake before moving to the back. His gaze was piercing, like a predator sizing up its prey. Jake's mind raced. Who was this guy? Why was he looking at him like that? The suited man's cold stare left Jake feeling exposed, like he was being watched by someone who already knew him far too well. And then, without a word, the man in the suit turned, heading toward the back door. Jake's pulse quickened. The man wasn't alone. He was with the figure who had been sitting at the table. They exchanged no words, but as they left, it was clear that the two were connected. The cafe felt smaller, suffocating. Jake's instincts screamed at him to leave, to get away from whatever was unfolding in front of him. But curiosity held him in place. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just become a part of something much bigger than himself, a game he didn't understand, and one that he wasn't ready to play. As the door closed behind the men, Jake sat frozen, the pieces of the puzzle starting to form in his mind. There was something darker at play here, something that went beyond a simple encounter in a cafe. The man wasn't just a random stranger, he was part of something much more dangerous. The question now was, how far was Jake willing to go to uncover the truth? The tension in the room thickened, and Jake felt the walls closing in. He had just crossed a line, and there was no turning back. Everything had changed. And he knew deep down that this was just the beginning. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the moment he had crossed the threshold of the cafe and laid eyes on the suited man, everything had begun to spiral out of control. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was a cold, gnawing certainty that he had stumbled into something far darker than he had ever imagined. For days after the encounter, he tried to act like nothing had changed. He went through the motions, keeping up appearances, hanging out with the group, and going to the same places they always did. But everything felt off. He couldn't stop thinking about the man in the cafe, the one who had taken down his crew so effortlessly. The man's gaze, the man in the suit, they haunted him. And the more he thought about them, the more it all seemed to make sense. Something was coming for him, for them all, and it wasn't going to be pretty. Jake knew he couldn't wait any longer. He had to know what was going on, what he was dealing with. He couldn't afford to just sit by and let whatever this was consume him, like some shadowy force lurking just outside his reach. It was late one night when Jake decided to take action. He called up Mark, Ben, and the others, and told them to meet at the usual spot, their hideout on the outskirts of town. The atmosphere was tense as they gathered around the table. The dim lighting and the smell of stale beer hung in the air. None of them had spoken since their last encounter with the man, and none of them wanted to be the first to acknowledge the fear they were all feeling. Jake was the first to break the silence. His voice was low, intense. We need to find out more about him. About what's really going on. Ben shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around the room. Are you sure about this man? After everything that happened, it's not worth it. Mark leaned forward, his face serious. You're asking us to go after a guy who took us all down in a matter of seconds. Do you really think we can handle whatever this is? Jake clenched his fists, the frustration building inside him. He wasn't about to back down. Not now. I don't care what we have to do. I need answers. We've crossed a line, and I'm not just going to sit here and wait for something worse to happen. A long silence followed. The tension between them was palpable, the weight of Jake's words hanging over the group like a heavy fog. Slowly, one by one, they nodded. They were in this together now, for better or worse. The plan was simple. They would start by tracking down the man in the suit. The one who had left the cafe with the mysterious figure. If they could find him, maybe they could learn more about the strange connection between him and the man who had humiliated them. Jake wasn't sure what he expected, but when they began their search, the answers didn't come easily. They followed the scant clues they had: a car seen leaving the cafe, the man's appearance in a few different places around town. But nothing added up. Every lead seemed to fade before they could catch hold of it, slipping away like sand through their fingers. Frustration mounted, and the sense of unease only grew with every dead end. They found themselves spiraling further into the unknown, the walls closing in around them. It was on the third day of their search when they found themselves outside an old, abandoned building at the edge of town. It was a place they had passed by countless times, a crumbling structure that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. But tonight, something felt different. The air was thick with tension, and the feeling of being watched was almost unbearable. Jake could feel his pulse quickening as he stepped closer to the building. "This is it," he said, his voice low. "This is where they've been." Mark was hesitant, glancing around nervously. "Are you sure we should do this? We have no idea what we're walking into." But Jake didn't hesitate. He led the group inside, each step taken in silence. The building was eerily quiet, the only sounds their footsteps echoing off the walls. The place smelled musty, the air stale with the scent of neglect. But there, in the dim light, they could make out shapes, figures moving in the shadows. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He motioned for the others to stay quiet as they crept through the dark halls, following the faint sounds of voices. They moved cautiously, aware that they were no longer in control. The fear had settled deep in their bones. Finally, they reached a door, slightly ajar, the voices inside growing clearer. Jake signaled for them to stop, and they crouched down, listening. The voices belonged to men they didn't recognize, voices low and urgent, speaking in code, planning something they couldn't understand. "We'll move in 2 days. We can't afford any mistakes this time," one voice said. "We've got eyes everywhere," another added. "No one gets out without us knowing." Jake's heart skipped a beat. This was bigger than they had imagined. These weren't just random thugs. This was an organized group, and whatever they were planning, it wasn't good. Mark's voice was barely a whisper. "We need to get out of here." "No." Jake hesitated, but before he could respond, the door to the room creaked open. In an instant they were spotted. The figures inside the room stood up, their eyes narrowing as they looked at Jake and the others. For a heartbeat, time seemed to stand still. Then, all hell broke loose. Jake and his crew bolted, running through the dark corridors of the building. The sound of footsteps echoed behind them, heavy, purposeful. They weren't just being chased, they were being hunted. Every turn they took only led them deeper into the maze of shadows, the walls closing in around them. The fear that had been simmering in Jake's chest exploded into full-blown panic. They couldn't outrun them. They couldn't escape. And then, in the distance, Jake saw a figure emerging from the shadows. It was him, The man from the cafe, the one who had brought them all to their knees. His cold gaze met Jake's, and for a moment, everything else seemed to blur. Jake's breath hitched in his throat. This wasn't just a man. It was the beginning of something far bigger, something that would consume them all if they didn't stop running. But it was too late. They had crossed a line they could never return from. And now, the shadows were closing in with no way out. Jake's pulse hammered in his ears as he sprinted through the dark, empty building. The footsteps behind him were growing closer, relentless, like shadows stalking him. Every corner seemed to lead deeper into the maze, and his body ached with exhaustion, but he couldn't stop. The air was thick with tension, every second feeling like a countdown. "Run!" Jake shouted over his shoulder to Mark and Ben, but his voice was swallowed by the pounding of their feet. They were too close. The building felt endless, the walls pressing in on them as they raced through the maze of corridors. Then, suddenly, Jake collided with something, or rather, someone. The figure in front of him was tall and solid, blocking his path. The man from the cafe. His cold, unblinking eyes locked onto Jake's, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. "Move!" Jake snapped, but the man didn't budge. He was a wall of stone, unfazed by Jake's urgency. The man's presence was suffocating, every part of him exuding danger. Without a word, the man stepped forward, his movements slow but deliberate. Jake tried to sidestep him, but the man was too quick. In an instant, Jake was thrown to the ground, pain shooting through his arm as it was twisted behind his back. "Did you really think you could escape?" The man's voice was smooth, chilling. "You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into?" Jake gasped, the pressure on his arm unbearable. He struggled, but the man's grip was iron. He was stronger, faster. Jake was helpless. "I don't," Jake managed to choke out, but the man cut him off. "You don't understand," the man said calmly. "You've crossed a line, and now you'll pay." With a flick of his wrist, the man released Jake. He collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. Every part of him ached. The man stepped back, his eyes studying Jake with an unsettling calm. "Get up," he said, his tone emotionless. Jake forced himself to his feet, his legs trembling. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice shaky. "What do you want from us?" The man didn't answer right away. His eyes flickered briefly to Mark and Ben, standing frozen behind Jake, before returning to him. "I'm not interested in who you are," the man replied. "What matters is that you've made a mistake." The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. Whatever this was, it was bigger than him. Bigger than anything he'd imagined. Before he could process what was happening, the door to the building slammed open. A group of men in dark suits entered, their presence overwhelming. Their faces were cold, expressionless. "Take them to the boss," one of the men said, his voice low. Jake's stomach dropped. This wasn't just some random thugs. This was something organized, something far more dangerous. They grabbed Jake by the arms, forcing him to move. His legs were shaking, his mind racing. There was no escape. They had crossed a line they didn't even know existed, and now there was no going back. The men dragged them through the building, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, his thoughts a blur. The further they went, the more the walls seemed to close in on them. Finally, they reached a small, dimly lit room. The man from the cafe stood by the door, his posture rigid. Inside, a man sat behind a desk, his back to them, the dim light casting long shadows on his face. "Sit," the man behind the desk commanded, his voice cold. Jake hesitated but sat down. Mark and Ben followed suit, their faces pale with fear. The air in the room was suffocating, thick with tension. The man behind the desk studied them, his eyes calculating. "You've made a mistake," the man said quietly. "You've crossed a line. Now, you'll pay the price." Jake's stomach churned. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but the words caught in his throat. This wasn't something they could talk their way out of. "I don't care who you are," Jake said, trying to sound confident. "We didn't ask for this. We didn't know." The man behind the desk raised a hand, silencing him. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, like a predator circling its prey. "No excuses," he said, his voice low. "You're in over your head. You think you can walk away from this? You think you can just escape?" Jake's mind raced. The walls seemed to close in tighter with every passing second. He could feel the weight of the man's gaze, like a physical presence. The man took a step closer, his eyes never leaving Jake's. "You've caught the attention of people who don't forgive. And now you'll regret crossing them." Jake's heart pounded in his chest, his palms slick with sweat. There was no escape, no way out. They were trapped, caught in something much bigger than they could understand. The man leaned in, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "By the time you understand what's happening, it'll be too late." Jake swallowed, his throat dry. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know what to do. This was bigger than him. Bigger than anything he could handle. The darkness had claimed them, and there was no way out. As the man spoke, the door to the room opened, and another group of men entered. They stood silently, their expressions cold, their eyes watching every move Jake and his friends made. The air in the room grew heavier, and Jake could feel the walls closing in. The man behind the desk took a final step forward, his presence overwhelming. "You've made a choice," he said, his voice cold as steel. "And now you'll face the consequences." Jake could barely breathe. His world had become a suffocating darkness, and he couldn't see any way out. There was no turning back now. The room felt like a tomb. The air was thick with fear, the silence deafening. Jake could feel the weight of the man's words pressing down on him, his heart racing, his every instinct screaming for a way out. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The darkness had already swallowed them whole. The man behind the desk stepped closer, his cold eyes never leaving Jake. "You think this is a game?" he asked, his voice low, almost mocking. "You think you can just stumble into this world and walk away without consequences?" Jake swallowed hard, his throat dry, his hands clammy. He couldn't speak. Every word seemed like a lie, every move felt like a mistake. But in that moment, he knew that survival meant silence. The man raised his hand, signaling for the others to step forward. Two of the men moved toward Jake, their hands grabbing him roughly by the shoulders, pushing him back down into the chair. Mark and Ben were already subdued, their faces pale with fear, their eyes wide with helplessness. "Take them to the back," the man behind the desk commanded. Jake's stomach twisted. "No, please," he pleaded, the words escaping before he could stop them. "We didn't mean any harm. We didn't know what we were doing." The man's lips curled into a cold smile. "It's too late for apologies." The men dragged Jake and his friends through the building, each step a painful reminder of how far they had fallen. The halls seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in tighter with every moment. The further they walked, the more oppressive the silence became. There were no voices now, no laughter, just the sound of their footsteps echoing in the emptiness. Finally, they reached a heavy door at the end of a long corridor. The air in the room beyond it was thick, stifling. Jake's pulse quickened as they were pushed inside. It was a small, dimly lit room, but the man from the cafe was already there, standing in the center, his cold eyes watching them like a predator circling its prey. He wasn't alone. A tall, thin man in a black suit stood beside him, his face expressionless, his hands clasped behind his back. The man behind the desk stepped forward, his presence overwhelming. "You've seen too much," he said quietly, his voice calm but deadly. "You've learned too much. And now, you're going to make things right?" Jake's mind raced. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What do you want from us?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he motioned to the tall man beside him. Without a word, the man stepped forward, his eyes scanning each of them with a chilling, calculated gaze. The man in the suit reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, silver device. A button of some kind. "This," the man said softly, "is how you pay for your mistakes." Jake's heart skipped a beat. "What is that?" he asked, his voice trembling. The man didn't answer. He pressed the button. Instantly, a low hum filled the room, the walls vibrating slightly. The air seemed to grow heavier, more oppressive. Jake's stomach twisted with fear as he looked around, trying to understand what was happening. And then he saw it. The walls of the room began to shift, revealing hidden panels, doorways, passageways, secret spaces that had been there all along. What is this?" Mark stammered, his voice shaking. "This is where you find out how far you're willing to go to survive," the man behind the desk said, his voice as cold as ice. "You'll make a choice. One that will change everything." Jake could feel the walls closing in. Every escape route seemed to lead to more danger, more uncertainty. He didn't know what the man wanted from them, but he knew one thing. It wasn't going to be easy. The tall man stepped forward again, his gaze unblinking. "You can walk out of here," he said slowly, "but you'll have to make a deal. You'll have to choose who lives and who dies." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "You'll choose," the man repeated, his tone final. "One of you will walk out of here alive. The others will be left behind." For a moment, the room was silent. The weight of the decision hung in the air like a suffocating fog. Jake looked at Mark and Ben, their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror. "Please," Mark whispered, his voice cracking. "We don't want to die." Jake's stomach twisted with guilt. How could he choose? How could he decide who lived and who died? It was an impossible choice, and yet the man was forcing them into it. The man behind the desk watched them with cold, calculating eyes. "You've crossed a line," he said again. "And now you'll see what it costs." The air in the room seemed to grow heavier with every second, the silence unbearable. Jake's mind raced. He couldn't think straight. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, suffocating him. His heart was pounding in his chest, his palms slick with sweat. "Make your choice," the man said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "Time is running out." Jake looked at Mark and Ben, his mind in turmoil. The seconds felt like hours. The man's cold eyes watched them, waiting, expecting them to make a decision. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The decision was made for him. He couldn't do it. He couldn't choose who lived and who died. With a final, desperate move, Jake threw himself at the tall man in the suit, hoping against hope that he could escape, that he could survive. The tall man stepped back, but the motion was too quick, too violent. In an instant, the room erupted into chaos. But as Jake struggled, he realized too late that this wasn't a fight he could win. The walls of the room seemed to close in, and the shadows swallowed them whole. The choice had already been made for them, and there was no escape. In the end, there were no winners. Just shadows.